Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Great, it's my pleasure. So tell us a little bit about your story and we'll get started.
Well, I'm 68 years old. I just turned 68 last month. I wrote two books. I had a terrible relationship with my father, which turned into a lot of fear and anxiety. And it culminated at 48. It turned into rectal cancer. So I had cancer at 48. All that anxiety went down to my belly and just chewed on me for years. And so I wrote a book called Reset that talked about my life up to about 60 years old. And then when I was 54, so basically 6 years later, I only had a foot and a half of my colon left, and my colon burst during a colonoscopy, and I was in really bad shape. So again, I wrote the book as kind of a way to express myself, kind of get all my stuff out in the open, and possibly help others that have severe anxiety and fear. And then my second book, excuse me, it's called I'm a Genius, Just Ask Me. In 2020, I read a book on stock options and I traded options, and my account went from 500. I was trading out of my 401k. It went from 550,000 to, in 6 months or 7 months, 1.7 million. So I really did well. And so, but then I lost half of it. So that was the reason for the second book, was to explain how I did it and how, let's say, an average guy could do well if he put his mind to it. Those are my two books.
So can you go a little bit deeper on the first book, what the first book is all about?
Yes. So I developed, my dad was a disciplinarian. We had seven kids in our family. I was the oldest boy, but the second oldest. And my dad was on me all the time through my life. And I at a young age, developed this fear of my father. And then at 19, I left home at 17. I graduated from high school and I went into the Air Force. It was really important for me, Richard, to get out of the house and become an adult. I got tired of my dad kind of dictating my life to me. He was a hitter. I got hit a lot. The mental anguish, being called a loser and stuff like that. A lot of people go into this stuff or have this stuff in their lives. Anyways, I went into the Air Force. And I was stationed in Japan, Okinawa, Japan. I came home from my sister's wedding unannounced. And I had my first panic attack at 19. And it really threw me for a loop. I didn't, I was unsophisticated. I didn't know what was happening to me. So I suffered from anxiety most of my life. And this happened at 19. At 35, I finally couldn't beat it anymore. So I went into therapy, which is a big part of my life. I encourage men to go into therapy. I think sometimes I know I felt ashamed and felt very weak and emasculated that I had these problems and couldn't resolve them. And then, and I state this in the book, I started bleeding when I went to the bathroom at 40. And I went and saw my doctors, and they always said it was just hemorrhoids or something. Well, it was probably the beginning of a tumor, because by the time they finally did a colonoscopy at 48, my tumor was the size of a bottom of a water bottle. And I was in tough shape. So had surgery. It's all in the book. I won't go into too much detail. And cancer was tough enough, but there was a certain amount of comfort in knowing I had cancer, because up until that point, Richard, everything was between my ears. It was all about anxiety and fear, it almost feeds off itself. So once I had a physical problem, kind of gave me comfort that, okay, now I got something I can touch and feel. So I was getting better. Again, a lot of this is detailed in the book Reset. At 54, I only had a foot and a half of my colon left, and my colon wall was very thin. When you have a colonoscopy, they blow air into your colon to expand it. Well, when they did that, unbeknownst to the doctor, my colon burst. and I was a mess. I was really, I weigh 215 pounds now. I was down to 150 pounds. I was skin and bones. I was basically dead man walking, but I never gave up. I had good doctors. There were a lot of mistakes that happened to me. I lost a kidney during one of the surgeries. My ureter got pinched, so I only have one kidney. Um, Mistakes were made, but I was able to, I think, having years of anxiety and then finally losing it. I didn't have solid food. My system had basically shut down, Richard. I didn't have solid food for 6 months. And that's the reason for the title of the book. I believe my body actually reset during that fasting period of no food. I had a PICC line in my arm. I had a big bag of liquid nourishment that I got from the pharmacist. And every day I would get hooked up with this stuff. I wasn't working at the time. I was too sick to even go into work. So I was on this bag of nutrition for 18 hours a day, and my body went to square one, and it reset. And I realized as I started to get better, I lost all my fear and anxiety. It was a total gift. I never thought I would have lost that.
Mentally, how did you deal with it?
Mentally, when I went through cancer, mentally I did good because, as I said, all of a sudden I had something physical I could work on. You know, when you have mental health issues, you can't touch them and you feel alone. And I had severe anxiety where I was having anywhere from 10 to 20 panic attacks a day. They were constant. And a lot of my panic dealt with food. My dad was a disciplinarian and he disciplined me, especially based on where I sat at the dining room table. He disciplined me at the dinner table to where food became a negative for me. I was in the Air Force at the time, so I was forced to eat at the chow hall around my friends. But I would eat and I'd start to feel nauseous right after I ate. So I would get up and walk out. And I did that. I did that for many years. Um, so there was a lot of hiding what I had. There was a lot of loneliness involved in it because you're kind of an actor, kind of acting your way through life, trying to not expose yourself and let people see, let's say, your weaknesses. And some of that I think is being a male. I was very cognizant that I had these problems, and it seemed important to me at the time to try and hide them from everyone.
And what about the recovery process, the reset?
The reset, so I didn't have solid food for 6 months. And I realized as I started to get better that I didn't have this anxiety anymore. And this was after I still suffered from anxiety, but not as much after I had cancer. But then when my system shut down and I didn't eat, and I went through a fasting process, um, I think my body just kind of reset. You know, Richard, I'm a real believer that if you take care of your body, it will take care of you. And even though I had all this stress and I was beating it up internally, I was always in good shape. When I got sick, I was a runner. I always used exercise as kind of a way to manage my anxiety, you know, through sweat and releasing that energy. And so exercise was a good way for me to get that. And so I was a runner. I weighed 185 pounds at the time I got sick. And so I was in good shape. I wasn't obese. I didn't smoke. I wasn't a big drinker. I didn't have a lot of these other bad habits, let's say, going into cancer. So it took a long time to recover. But once I realized I didn't have it anymore, my life really took off. I realized I didn't have this fear anymore. And I had some pretty, you know, I was forced as a male, let's say, as the breadwinner of the house and a guy with a family, I was forced to continue on even though I had these issues. And what I mean by that, Richard, is I went to work every day. I have an accounting degree, and so I was the controller of small companies. But I had the opportunity to go to Nike. Nike is located in the Portland area. I was the U.S. payroll manager for Nike for 4 years. And so that was a very difficult job. And I remember actually driving to Nike and kind of dry heaving and getting overly anxious in my car. And once I got there and I grabbed that door, it was go time. I would like switch, and I knew I had to be strong. I had 18 people underneath me that I managed. And if they saw me as weak or that I couldn't do my job, I was toast. I would have gotten fired. So I had to force myself to go to work. I had a family to support. It probably, that forcing, if you will, probably saved my life. I didn't have the luxury of crawling in the corner, sitting there and feeling sorry for myself. And I consider that a gift. It was very hard. It was very difficult, but I made it.
So going back, you would say that the fear that you had over the years and the anxiety brought the cancer?
Yes, absolutely. When I get anxious, for me, it hit me in my stomach, and my stomach would get really tight. I even tried to use alcohol to kind of mask the symptoms and get me anxious. Like, as an example, when I was married to my wife, or we were maybe even dating at the time, I would start worrying about going to her folks' house for Thanksgiving in September, because Thanksgiving is a food festival. And I had an issue with food. I had a very hard time sitting down and eating, especially in front of people, because if I started feeling nauseous, I would cough. And so it was an embarrassment. So I was always calculating where I was going to go and what I was going to do. And that was a huge part of my life. It was my way, Richard, of trying to control the situation. But I couldn't even drink a lot because my stomach would get so tight and just kind of gnaw at me. And then it got to the point where I was bleeding when I went to the bathroom, and that was a huge sign for me. And I would go to my doctors. I was always upfront with my doctors, told them what was going on. But sadly, in the United States here, at the time, anyways, this was 20 years ago. At the time, you couldn't get a colonoscopy until you were 50 years old. And I was 48, or I was 40 at the time I started bleeding. And so it went on for 8 years. And then at 48, I was taking some vitamins that were prescribed to me by a chiropractor. And I started bleeding really bad. And I went to my doctor, and he said, well, Mark, you've been complaining about this for years. Let's do a colonoscopy. And sure enough, like I said, my tumor was the size of the bottom of a water bottle. And at that point, I was screwed. Then I went into radiation, chemo, had surgery. Again, it's all lined out in my book. Went through the whole 9 yards.
So you've been successful with the stocks. So how was that process like? Did you do a lot of learning before you got into it? And talk to us about that.
Yes, I have a financial background, and when I left Nike, I was at my last employment for 15 years. And as the controller, financial guy of the company, I was basically in charge of the 401k. So I was always interested in the 401k administration. So I was always interested as a person in the stock market. It was, for me, Richard, it was kind of a way of how can my money make money without me sweating it, without me digging a ditch? How can I make my money work for me? So I always traded, but not a lot. And when I retired, I moved my money to a financial person. And I thought I was in this stock. It's in my book, I'm a Genius. I was in this stock that was getting crushed. And I lost probably at one time I was down 250,000 out of my account. I was getting killed in this stock. but I hung on and it came back and I basically got my money back. So when I retired, I decided, okay, I'm done trading. I took a risk. I was grateful I got my money back, but maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. So I moved my money to a financial person. And the first year, I think, based on the percentage, and then we paid for some extras and stuff. I think I paid her $10,000, and we didn't even beat the S&P 500 that year. And I thought, well, what am I paying for? And I have a good buddy that I had lunch with, and he said, Mark, you're smart enough to trade your own stocks or manage your own account. Why don't you really consider doing that? So I did. So I closed it down and I started reading a lot of books. And I came across a book called How to Make Millions Using Stock Options. And I put it in my book. And I actually took a course on stock options many years ago. And to be honest with you, Richard, when I walked out of that seminar, it was one of those seminars at the Embassy Suites. I paid $4,000 for this course. And honestly, when I walked out of there, I didn't have the first clue what an option. And so I found this book on Amazon and I read it like 6 times. And I was like, this is the real deal. So I called the author and I said, let me pay you to teach me how to do this. And so his name is Jeff Weber. He's the author of the book. Paid him like $250. It was a joke. And I started trading the first week of March, right when they shut the world down for COVID. And I don't know if you remember, Richard, but the stock market dumped and then it took off. So I started trading my account in March of 2020 using the formula in the book, the system in the book. And I lost $125,000 in 2 weeks. My account went from 550 to 425. And as I put in the book, probably 99% of the people that were in my position would have stopped trading and said, this is bullshit. It's not going to work. And I stuck with it. And so the market came down and then it blasted off. And I was my goal was to make or to have $1 million in my account. So all I had to make was 500,000. I started with 550,000. And I thought maybe if I was lucky, I could do that by the end of the year. Well, I hit the $1 million mark like in July. I started trading in March. I hit like in July. And then by the end of December, my account was up to 1.7 million. I mean, I crushed it. I crushed it. And I felt like invincible, Richard. Like I had figured out the stock market. Like, why isn't everybody doing this? This was so easy. In hindsight, I was on that wave, the trend went straight up. I was just in the right place at the right time. So after 2020, entering into 2021, I went up to almost $2 million. And I don't want to say I didn't think my shit stunk, but I got really aggressive and I kind of pulled away from the actual plan and started buying more often and more option contracts, even though the system said not to. And let's call it cocky, let's call it greed, let's call it stupidity, which is probably really what it was. And so, anyways, I wound up losing about 600,000 or 700,000 in the process. Now, the good news is, everybody's like, "Ooh, wow." The good news is, I bought my way out of debt. I'm currently in Mexico. My wife and I own a casa here in Mexico. The beach is a block away. The swimming pool is right next to our house. And then we own a cabin in Oregon. Both properties are paid for. So I have no debt. And then my wife has a pension she was a teacher, and we both get our Social Security. So what that money did for me, and this is a huge point, this is why people work and save, is it bought me freedom and it bought me no debt. And for that, I'm grateful. I'm sad I lost all that money, but I'm okay.
So are you still trading today?
Yes, but a lot less. As a matter of fact, I have some NVIDIA contracts right now. But what happened was I lost so much money, and then we spent quite a bit of money. I used the money to buy this casa. I paid cash. And then we remodeled our cabin in Oregon, and I paid cash for that. And so not only was I taking money out of my 401k, I had to pay the tax on it as well because this was all pre-tax. I think I've paid $200,000 in taxes over the last 2 or 3 years just because I pulled so much money out to get all this stuff done. So one of the things I would encourage people, thank God I put money aside so that I wasn't trading my whole account. That would have been suicide. I think if I had not pulled that money aside, I would have continued trading and quite possibly lost it all, as it happens to a lot of people. There's a lot of books out there about that. So to answer your question, I do still trade. It's a lot less. I think I will, as long as I have a dollar, I think I will always trade, Richard. There's probably an argument that I'm addicted to trading. I love it. It kind of what gets me. I'm a big financial guy, and I'm a big exercise guy. I belong to a gym here in La Paz. I'm in La Paz, Mexico. Belong to a gym. I go 4 times a week. I walk a lot, so it's really important to stay financially fit and physically fit as well.
What would you say to people who want to reset their life?
Boy, that's a good question. I think you can always improve. One thing that I'm big on, and this is something that I hated as a kid, is I'm a big reader. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books about investment, read a lot of books about, let's call them self-help or introspective. I'm wound pretty tight. And, because of my jobs and my anxiety, I had to be forceful. I wouldn't say I was a jerk to work for because I always felt like I was fair. But, I expected people to do their jobs. But as I retired, you realize, it's interesting when you retire because all of a sudden you're not having to go to work every day, assuming you've made enough money, you have a pretty good life. A lot of your anxiety and fear in life is related to money. And I believe that. I take some hits from my wife and my daughter. Dad, you focus on money too much. Well, everybody needs money, and money doesn't solve all your problems, but it sure can solve a lot of them. And it's pretty rare that you find people who don't have money who are happy. Um, I'm not saying that having money makes you happy, but it certainly takes away a lot of stressful situations. So I would to answer your question about resetting, I would look at yourself physically and say, am I in the kind of shape I want to be in? Look at yourself emotionally and say, how are my relationships going? How do I relate to people? Look at yourself financially and say, am I in good shape? Am I saving money? And then, develop good habits. I try to work out or do something physical every day. Again, I'm retired, but I think anybody can do it. I'm a big reader. I read every day. I have Kindle, and you can sign up for Kindle and you get quote free books. You rent them, if you will, and then you give them back when you're done. I read every day. And I'm very grateful. At 60 years old, I went to see my dad up in Seattle. I lived in Portland, and I walked into his apartment, and I remember for the first time at 60 years old, I had no fear. And that was for me a huge reset. I realized my dad couldn't hurt me anymore. And so I pounded. I guess my point is, Richard, face your fears, pound through them. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. And then get help If you got an issue, it's one thing to have anxiety. We all have anxiety. But if fear and anxiety are dominating your life, where you're avoiding people, avoiding situations, you got a problem, you should go and get help. There's nothing wrong with saying you got a problem.
Where can people follow you on social or the internet?
I'm on Instagram and Facebook. In Instagram, I'm under Mark /C/Doherty. And then in my books, I put my email addresses in my books, and you can find my books. They're ebooks on Amazon Kindle. I didn't have them printed up. I just thought it would be too expensive, and I was kind of a rookie. I'd never written books before, so I wrote Reset, and then I did so well in the market. And I always try, as Mark Doherty, I try to find investment books for guys like me. And what I mean by that is just regular guys trying to find something they could latch onto that's going to make them money. It's very hard to start a business, whether you're selling a product or a service. The market, it's just between you and the market. And so if you have confidence and you read and you follow a plan, you can be successful. You don't have, what I like about the market is you succeed or fail based on your own person. If you got a great product, but you can't market it or you don't have enough money to get it out there, who do you blame? When you're in the market, if you screw up, you screw up. It's all on you.